Hopefully this won't crash the system. It's 30 megabytes.
Okay,
That's the problem
should we,
with photographs.
are we good to launch the webinar now?
Let's try it.
Well, mine is moving slow to you, that's for sure.
Okay, well, we'll start off with some introductions and trivia, and we'll see what happens.
And talk through the chat.
Yeah.
So I don't have to click start here. Do you want me to start, or somebody else in control now?
Here, I can start it. There we go. Okay.
All right, hello everyone. It looks like our attendees are filing in.
Welcome everyone. Give just a second for a couple more people to come in. The number's still increasing. But for all of you who've just joined us, welcome to Science on Tap. Welcome to our first Science on Tap of 2021. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sierra Melton, and I'm a graduate student in geosciences, and I'm also a member of the Science Policy Society and one of the coordinators of the Science on Tap events. So the Science Policy Society at Penn State is a student organization that looks at the intersection of science and policy, and we focus on self-education, engagement with legislators, and community outreach. So Science on Tap is one of our outreach initiatives, and it provides us an opportunity to learn about a diverse array of scientific subjects from some really awesome scientists. So tonight we have two of those awesome scientists joining us, Dr. Erica Smithwick and Dr. Alan Taylor.
Okay, and so like Sierra said, our experts tonight are Dr. Erica Smithwick and Dr. Alan Taylor. Dr. Erica Smithwick is a landscape and ecosystem ecologist and professor of geography. She's also the director of the Ecology Institute and associate director of the Institutes of Energy and Environment at Penn State. She founded the Center for Landscape Dynamics, which connects science to management. And her Landscape Ecology Lab group is actively involved in understanding how a wide range of disturbances, especially fire, affect ecosystem function at landscape scales. She has served as a Fulbright Scholar in South Africa at the Rhodes University and has received numerous research awards. Dr. Alan Taylor is a professor of geography and the director of the Vegetation Dynamics Lab at Penn State. He has broad research interests in ecological biogeography and vegetation dynamics, particularly within the role of natural and human disturbance and climate variation on forest dynamics. His recent research has focused on land use history, climate, fire disturbance, and forest conditions in the Western United States. He has also conducted research on the dynamics of subalpine bamboo forests with giant pandas in China, and on highland bamboo forests in mountain gorilla habitat in Rwanda. And so tonight they'll be focusing on discussing their research on fire in a warming world.
All right, and to get started, we have a couple of trivia questions for everyone. So the first question is approximately what % of wildfires are caused by humans? 30%, 60%, 80%, or 100%?
We have a poll that you can fill out if you haven't seen that yet. Okay, it looks like most people have voted, and it's a pretty even split between 60% and 80%. And Sarah, if I'm wrong, I think it's 80, right?
Yeah, the correct answer is 80%. And I also found some sources that said 90%. So it's around 80 to 90% of wildfires that are caused by humans. Okay, the next question. In 2020, Wildfires burned how many acres in the US? $3.5 million, 6.7 million, 9.1 million, or 10.3 million?
All right. Looks like almost everyone has voted. And most people put 10.3 million, which is correct. Pretty scary numbers.
That's a lot of acres. It's hard to even really imagine that. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
And I found my screen, so I can share mine.
Oh, wonderful.
Great.
All right, so now we'll start the presentations from our guest speakers, starting with Dr. Taylor.
So Erica and I talked about it. We've both been working on fire in the Western US for quite a while. And people able to see my screen? They see a slide? Yes, Hannah, that's correct. You can see it?
Yes, but it's still pretty small.
Yep, I'm gonna work on that. Okay, how's that?
It's slowly loading. Okay.
Now,
Yep.
now I can see it. Yep.
Yeah, I have slow internet where I live. And so what I wanted to do is start talking about fire and look backward and look at climate fire relationships, and particularly how people, since 80 to 90% of people seem to be starting fires, what that means, and then end up in California in about 2020, and then have Erica talk about the futures, because that's that's the kind of work she does. So I'm going to sort of take us on going back through time and looking at what controls fire and then how that's changed, but really emphasizing the role of people, because it's not just climate. So just for people who aren't that familiar with the idea of climate and climate variability, what we're going to be talking about is climate change. And that means a trend over time, like the upper box. And how does fire respond to a long-term trend? Now, on top of that trend is the yearly variability and how much it rains or how hot it is. And when you combine them, you get the situation on the bottom where you have a trend and then you have variability around that. And you're going to have fires when it's hot or dry year, but you also have an increasing temperature, increasing dryness over a longer period of time. So what does that do to fire activity? So we're going to be focusing on that long-term trend, not short-term variability. Now, in looking at the sort of data that you presented about fires in the United States, what we're looking at in terms of what controls that are in that box with the wildfire and fire regime triangle. It's a particular event that you might have for a particular wildfire might be strongly controlled by the weather conditions and the terrain and the fuel. But over a longer time period, when climate is changing, you're really looking at vegetation, climate, and ignitions, which could be lightning or they could be people. So we're going to be focusing on that. I'm going to be focusing in that sort of larger scale domain and what controls fire activity back through time and then how we know that. This will be familiar to all of you. It's long-term trends in the Earth's temperature back to about 1880 from instrumental data. It's pretty clear it's getting warmer since, particularly since the 1980s, but there's a long-term trend that goes back centuries, and that's being forced by carbon dioxide, which most of us know. And so the period of time where we've had all this fire activity that's been in the news is the last decade or two, and it's much warmer than it used to be. Now, if anybody was paying much attention to the news about this time last year, Australia was burning madly. they had massive fires there because of extreme droughts that had developed over years. And you can see that their temperatures over the last 100 years or 120 years have been going up, just like they have on a global scale. And the vegetation dried out so much that it created these firestorms, which had a major impact. And Australia has a Mediterranean climate, a winter wet, summer dry, which is the opposite of ours. And so when I was teaching last January, we were following this incredible amount of fire activity and talking about it. Now, come summer, we had the same thing going on in California. If we look at California's temperature record, it's been going up much like Australia's and everywhere else on Earth over that period of time. And we had the biggest fire season in at least the contemporary period of record keeping, which goes back into the late 1800s, of fire activity in California. And about 4 million acres burned in 2020. And the average number of acres that might burn in California is about 500,000. So just a massive increase. And it's interesting that it happened in these same climate types in different parts of the world. And you're having the same kind of response in places like Portugal and France and Spain for some of the same reasons that I'm going to talk about that has happened in California. Some of the drivers are different, but we're seeing this pickup in fire activity across the Mediterranean regions across the globe. And this also provides a bit of a perspective and explains some of that. This is a graph showing monthly temperatures from 1880, which is in blue at the bottom of the bell curve, up to 2019. And so it represents the annual cycle of temperature on the globe through the months of the year. And what you'll notice is that in 1880, the fire season that we usually associate with fires in the mountainous regions of the Western US, the fire season went from about June to August. And that same temperature during the fire season now goes between about mid-April and mid-September. And so the length of the fire season has almost doubled as temperatures have warmed. And it is that fire season which creates a real problem for fire activity and people and smoke and firefighters and everything else. And this shows the relationship between warming temperatures and fuel aridity and the whole Western United States during the past several decades. And these are data that are generated from satellite data that is able to identify the scars that are created by fires on the landscape. And they've just been divided in half, basically the years 84 to 1999. And then we've cut the record again from 2000 to 2015. And you can see there's a really tight relationship between area burn across the Western US and fuel aridity. And fuel aridity is a measure that's based on temperature. It's a measure of how much moisture gets pulled from live and dead vegetation. And that is strongly influenced by annual temperature. So all this is telling us is all these data are saying that it's getting warmer, the fuels are getting drier, and because of that, fires are getting bigger. If you notice, most of the red dots are to the left of the curve, and the blue dots tend to be below the line. So that trend is increasing. It's getting drier. The fuels are getting drier. When fuels are drier, it's easier to burn, and things burn more intensely. So all this is telling us there's a very close linkage between climate and fire, but the nature of the kind of fires you get are not simply determined by climate. It's really strongly influenced by people. And what I want to do is sort of share with you how you can look at this over a longer time period and gain a perspective for what's happening today with the past. And I'm going to talk about some work that Jennifer Marlin at Yale has done and a number of other paleoecologists that give us a perspective on what fire activity was like back in the past. And what these folks are doing here is they're coring a lake, and they're pulling up a tube of lake sediments that have layers of sediment and charcoal in them, in layers. And it's basically, it's a time slice of the sedimentation in the lake. And one of the things that gets into lakes in areas where there's fire activity is charcoal. And you can take the charcoal out of the layers and you can count the particles, you can count them by size, and you can come up with an estimate of how much fire activity there was back through time. And what this is the graph showing that charcoal abundance for the past 1,500 years. And so if we go to about 1,500 years ago, we can see that there was a less fire activity. It began to increase about 1,000 years ago to about 400 years ago. And much of this period is in a period they call the medieval climate anomaly, when it was warmer in the northern hemisphere and in the western US. And then the climate trend cools into what they call the little ice age, and you can see that fire activity goes down. We come out of the little ice age in about 1850 or so, and fire activity goes up. So the fire activity is following really pretty closely long-term trends in temperature, which is shown in blue here, and drought, which makes sense, right? Climate, as we've sort of shown, has a close linkage there. But what I want to do is call your attention to this section of the graph right here, where we have fire activity going down, but temperature is going up and drought is going up. And so fire activity should have gone up and followed these other trends, but it didn't. And this is what we call a fire deficit, and that's driven by human activity. So even though it seems like we're getting many more acres burned a year in the Western US, in the past, there was much more fire activity than there is today. And this decline, if we're looking at it on a long-term scale, is related to human activity. And if we go up to the top of the graph, you can see here, this is a record of historical fires that were mapped by different agencies or we have written records of. And you can see that they increased up to about 1850 and then crashed. And this is a record of fires from fire scars in trees. And again, you can see there's pretty high fire activity up until about the mid 1800s, and then it crashes. And so there's been a huge change in fire activity driven by long-term climate trends beginning in about 1850. And that's because of people. And that change has created conditions for the kind of fires that we're seeing today. And I'd like to spend a few minutes going through that. This is a piece of wood extracted from a pine tree in California that had a wound in it, and you could see into the tree or the edges of the tree, and it had in it a number of fire scars. These are lesions in a tree which are caused by a fire damaging the tree, and then the tree heals over that lesion or that wound. And each one of these represents the year of a fire. If you date the tree rings in it, you can date the fire to an exact year. And what you can see in this tree is that fires were burning regularly at intervals of 5 to 15 years. And they go back to the before 1500. Our earliest records go back to 1,000 years. And fire activity is common until you get to about 1890, and then you see no fire activity. That's a unique period in the record. And if you think about what we saw with the charcoal record and the documentary record, it's all saying the same thing, that fire activity was basically taken out of the system. And that's had a big impact. And the reason it's had a big impact is if you think about how fire used to work in the landscape, fires consume fuel. And what you're looking at here is an area where a fire burned and it consumed the fuel. And if another fire comes in from the bottom right of the screen in this fuel that's on the ground and it hits this area, it's going to stop. And so when you have a landscape that has lots of these fire scars in it, other fires burn into it and stop. And so you don't have fires spreading very readily. And because fires were relatively frequent, there wasn't very much fuel. And so the kind of fires you had might have flame lengths of a foot or two, and that was about it. So that mosaic of burned and unburned and low fuels was really what drove the fire activity in the forests out in the southwestern US. Now, this is a photograph of Yosemite Valley in 1870 in the upper left. Yosemite Valley was first entered by European peoples in 1851, and you'll notice that it's an open oak forest here and a meadow. And I retook that same photograph in 2010, and you can see that most of the oak forest has been replaced. There's a few left, and we have conifers which have been encroached on that. And that's because we've taken Native Americans and their burning practice out of the picture. These are mortars in Yosemite Valley. Black oak acorns were a staple of their diet, and they used to burn regularly to create conditions which were favorable to oak. Oak acorns get attacked by a weevil when they're 1 year old or less than 1 year old. And so by burning under the oaks, you maintain an environment which keeps the oak acorn sound and therefore good as a food source. So we took out this, with the loss of the Native American burning, we really changed the fire regime, and you can see that, it changed the vegetation. Now we had a shock to the system. That shock began in about 1769. California was colonized later than much of the US from Mexico by the Spanish, and they set up missions along the coast. Before that, there was only hunter-gatherers. None of the Native American tribes in California were agricultural. And when they set up the missions, they subjugated the Native Americans and wanted to turn them into agriculturalists. And they kept very detailed records, and disease spread through the Native American population, and the population crashed. And Native Americans carried that disease up into the mountains. There were trade routes between the mountains and the coast. And that created a population crash over a very short period of time, several decades. And then in 1848, when gold was discovered in California, the largest migration in American history happened in about 2 years. The population of Euro-Americans went from 14,000 to 300,000, so everybody could go get rich finding gold. And so they pushed into the mountains and other parts of the landscape, finished off the Native Americans through very aggressive practices, and even bounties on the Native Americans by the state. And these people had to be fed. So large ranches were established in the mountains. Most of the money made in the gold rush was not made by the gold miners, but by all the people selling what the gold miners wanted. And you can see that the area where this happened was over a very, very wide part of the Sierra Nevada. And then we had fire suppression management laid on top of that in 1905 when the Federal Forest Reserve System was set up. And this is what the firefighter in 1905 looked like, somebody on a horse with a rake and a burlap sack, which is not what a firefighter looks like today. They're flying an airplane and having to dump hundreds of tons of retardant to put a fire out. This was effective fire suppression back then. So something has changed, and that thing is fuels. And so what we wanted to do was look at how this human activity over the past 400 years changed fire regimes. So we collected a bunch of those fire scarred samples and trees and old stumps that we could find across the whole Sierra Nevada. So we're looking at it on a regional basis. And we collected something nearly 2,000 of these wood samples and dated 19,000 of them, a ridiculous amount of information. And what we were thinking is that people had to have had a big imprint on fire activity. And how did that change over time? And what we see is this is just the record of fire activity since 1600 based on that tree ring information. And this is a line that shows significant changes in the amount of fire activity over time. And you can see there was one here in about 1770, another one in about 1860, and another one in 1904. And all those correspond to when human activity changed on a large scale in California. This represents the last 100 years or so. And there was a change in about 1940, which is when World War II was occurring, and they actually stopped fighting fires using large scale or high technology. And then there was a big bump that's happened since about 1980. And you'll notice that if we look at temperature over that same period of time or drought, there's no corresponding shift in fire activity, except here with temperature in the last 30 years. And so really what we're seeing here is fire activity was driven by changes in human activity on a large scale. That doesn't mean that climate's still not important, but the big changes are related to human activity. And one thing I just want to point out before we move on is that if we look at the influence of drought, drought is obviously necessary for widespread fire activity. It's got to be dry. If we look at how the relationship between fire and drought has changed over time, you can see that during this period when the Native American depopulation occurred, drought and fire were very, very tightly linked over this 150-year period. And that's because we lost that fire mosaic that used to keep fires from spreading. And so that means fires became driven simply by drought, and they became able to burn over very, very large areas of the landscape. So actually, area burned back in the 1800s was much larger than it is today. And we see in that record, if we think about what I showed with the pollen record and charcoal record, we see the fire activity and then it drops off in 1900. So we still have this fire deficit. If we just use temperature to predict what fire activity would be, we should be way up here, following temperature as we would expect. And so we have this big deficit in fire. So why is that important, or what has that done to the current situation? And what it comes down to is what pulling fire out has done to change the condition of fuels on the ground. These are sets of photographs that were taken by surveyors back, original surveys were in 1923, taken from marked survey points by the General Land Office. And these photographs are taken in Lassen National Park, where the only kind of human activity to influence the landscape is fire suppression. It was never logged, never grazed or anything else. And I went back to these locations and retook the same photographs from the same marked point. And you can see between 1923 and 1993, how much the vegetation has changed because fire was taken out. It used to burn here in these systems about every 10 years. Without the ground fires to kill the regeneration, those trees grew up to be mature. And then when I took the same photo again in 2010, and then a fire occurred, a lightning strike, and you can see that it burnt the whole forest down. So it changed the nature of the kind of fire activity that occurred because we've increased fuels. Here's another photograph from a different location showing the same sequence. Take fire out, fuels grow up, a fire occurs, and all the trees are killed. These trees are hundreds of years old, and now they've all been killed. They could only be hundreds of years old if the fires were not lethal when they were growing. The same situation here, another photo pair. Open forest with old trees, some certainly areas where it burned at higher severity. Stop fire, it fills in, a fire happens, kills all the trees, and in some cases, we're now getting a conversion to a non-forest kind of condition. And so the reason we're having so much fire activity and it's being severe is a combination of climate and fire activity. So in terms of management on the landscape that's contributing to the fire problem, we graze, we remove fuels, we've added fire suppression, and that reduced the burned area and allowed biomass to accumulate, particularly in forests that used to burn frequently. And so now we have much more biomass. We estimate 3 to 4 times more biomass than used to be in these same forests. It's getting drier. Droughts are getting drier, and it's getting more arid. And we have a longer fire season, so that time that fires can burn is longer, which promotes fire activity. And if we also look at management with this added biomass and then add how firefighters actually work, the only fires that we're seeing today are that you might see on television or end up on the news are fires that escape initial attack because the weather is so severe or the terrain is so difficult or there's so many ignitions that it overwhelms the fire service. So the reason we're seeing so much fire activity is out there, we're so good at putting out 99% of the fires that the only ones that happen are under the worst conditions, making it almost impossible to put them out. And that's being also strongly influenced by that warming trend. And so what does the future look like? You know, we have a warming climate, we have all these fuels, and we need to know where we're going to go. And I'll let Erica take off from there. And I guess I'll hold questions until after Erica's spoken, so we can, I guess, try to answer questions that might come up.
Great, thanks, Alan. I think you need to, there we go. All right. Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Sierra and Hannah for inviting us, and thanks to Alan for a great intro to what I'd like to talk about today. Hopefully you can all see my slides here. I'm going to, Alan's provided a great context for what I'd like to talk about, which is the geography of fire, as well as where fire is going in the future. And I'll use my own research in Yellowstone as sort of a mini case study for that. But I'd like to also step us back a little bit and think about the context in which this is happening. And Alan has alluded to that in terms of reference to Native American burning patterns. And in many cultures, fire has been a part of human society and land management and livelihoods for all of humanity. And so this is an example here. This is Prometheus, a Titan who is in Western mythology, stole fire from the gods and gave it as a gift to man. And as punishment, Zeus tied him to a rock, and his liver was eaten out every day anew by an eagle. And I kind of like this story because to me it epitomizes some of the challenges. This gift of fire that was given to us by the gods, if you take this perspective, is now a source of tension for human society of how we manage it and what we do with this gift that we've been given. And so examples such as this on the news of wildfires are all over the place. And I think, as Ellen has contextualized very well, what we need to do is now look at that and think, okay, what have we done with land management? What have we done with the climate? And how are we now going to put fire back in Pandora's box, so to speak? But as we grapple with those questions, one of the things we need to realize is that fire and fire histories and fire futures are likely to be different across space. And this is due to a variety of both social and environmental factors. And we call that essentially pyrogeography. So the distribution of fire regimes across the landscape. And here you see a map of these regimes across the United States. And you can see areas that are evidenced with really frequent low severity fires historically, as well as areas that are evidenced by a very rare fire, those infrequent areas in blue, and then many places in between. And so when we think about the context of what fire should be in a landscape, we really have to think about what the regime has been in the past, and really, truly, because we have the power, what we want it to be in the future. All of these sort of quote unquote natural fire regimes are very much interwoven with the wildland urban interface. And this is this zone where built infrastructure and human communities are intermingled with the natural environment. And we're interested in this zone because as fires expand on the landscape, we are interested in protecting our structures and protecting lives. And so understanding the interface is really important for adaptation and resilience. Of course, as was indicated in those initial quiz questions and through Alan's talk, we also understand that humans are important for another reason, and that is ignitions. So if you have the fuels there and you have the right climate, like drought, the other factor that you need is an ignition source. And so as you have people intermingling in these landscapes, you're likely to have a higher propensity for fire. So understanding where this intermingling is happening across the landscape is really important. And as you can see here, there's a lot of geography to this pattern. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the West, surprisingly, despite the fact that we see pictures of homes being burned down all the time horrifically in this area, the map of the wildland urban interface zone is actually less dense than in the East. And that's okay for us now because our fire hazard is a lot lower than in the West. But it means that if there is a fire, like the Gatlinburg fire, for example, several years ago, you can have significant damage. So even one fire can do a lot of damage in the East just because of that tight intermingling. In addition, we have a very complex land ownership pattern across the United States. You see a lot of the federal land in the West, and in the East, you see a lot of private land or state land. And so this makes the challenge and the governance of fire management or fire preparedness and fire stewardship a lot trickier because you have to manage across very complex land ownership systems. As Alan alluded to, in general, there is actually a decline, even globally, in burned area across the United States. And this is based on the Global Fire Emissions Database. And again, this goes against the narrative that fires are exacerbating across the world because of climate change. And so you have to ask yourself, well, I thought climate change was causing wildfires. And the truth is it is. In many regions where you are getting that extreme drought, where you have that fuel buildup, we are seeing higher intensity of wildfires, higher severity, larger area burned. But globally, because of this change in livelihood structures, because of fire suppression, and because of urbanization, frankly, and a change in livelihoods, you actually have a global decline. So that just speaks to the fact that we have to think of this as a scaled problem, right? We might have a slight decline in global emissions, but we have hotspots where this fire activity is increasing, and both of those can be true at the same time. And so when we take that global perspective, we can look at these hotspots, many of which have been in the news. Brazil, the Amazon burning up, you may remember that back in 2019. We have that particular fire event actually being caused dominantly by human-caused fire due to land use change and basically land grabs and deforestation and the preservation of large agricultural systems. And so this always looks like a guitar to me, but this is actually a bulldozer taken from space. And you can see these degraded landscapes meeting the Amazon forest there, where large fires are not a natural part of the system. And this, of course, then affects all sorts of social factors, such as indigenous knowledge and indigenous use of the landscape, traditional uses. It goes into land rights and land ownerships. It goes into politics. It goes into who owns that land and how are we managing it? Is it for large agriculture? Is it for traditional livelihoods? How are we going to manage it? So when we think about fire, it's a climate problem, it's a human problem, and even within that human problem, we have many, many layers of factors that we need to take into consideration. It's not just in the Amazon, though. We also have fires occurring in the Arctic. And this is particularly concerning from a climate perspective, because this is a place where from a relative perspective, the human influence has been less. And yet we see tremendous burning in the Arctic, even in tundra ecosystems that aren't used to fire. And you have massive amounts of peat now burning off hundreds of thousands of years of carbon storage. And that does cause a positive feedback to the atmosphere and to climate change. This is all in the same year, by the way. And then we have this more pictures from the Arctic. Again, you can see fires burning in places where fire is not normal, shall we say, at least in according to our records. We have fires in the Pacific Northwest, into old growth ecosystems of the Pacific Northwest and California, again, all within the same 12-month period. And the Australia, same image that Alan grabbed, really iconic image. This used to be an image of a deer crossing a river in the Rocky Mountains. Now it's a kangaroo in Australia, but we have these iconic images. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the Australian fires, something like 46 million acres burned. So that's 5 times more than burned in the US period, even though we can stagger at the 10 million that burned here. So we do have a lot of fire, and it's happening all over the world. And I think that's one of the major concerns here for us. It also is happening closer to home. So we're at Penn State, and there is actually wildfire risk in pocketed areas around us. So this is the pine lands in New Jersey, where pitch pine ecosystems have actually adapted to severe fire and are now managed in a way that they prevent large wildfires from spreading into obviously very highly populated areas of southern New Jersey. There's the image on the left is from a Rolling Stone article, and the title to that article. And again, this goes to the fact that within 24 hours, a large wildfire, if it escapes, could cross New Jersey, because our landscapes are relatively smaller compared to those larger landscapes we see in the West, where they take days, and they have days, to put out a fire before it comes into contact with humans. So again, one fire could do as much damage in these areas, even if it happens less frequently. And we're also interested in fire and fire management for ecological reasons. So in many parts of the East and the Mid-Atlantic region, we're actually trying to restore ecosystems and restore systems that were dependent on fire for habitat management. And we have, Alan and I together have been working with fire managers in the region that are purposely trying to put fire on the landscape to manage for game species, for hunting purposes, and to restore some of those pitch pine ecosystems where fire has been taken out of the ecosystem. So fire is complex, right? In some places we want to put it back in some places we want to take it out. And the science is trying to understand where that each is appropriate. In that context, we've been working with managers and trying to understand their perceptions of the challenges of putting fire back on the landscape where it's needed, as well as community perceptions. When you're faced with fire risk, that's a scary thing. And so why should they accept active fire management? And there are reasons why they might want to, but the messaging of that is particularly challenging for land managers. So scientists can act as a bridge and try to communicate these subtle but very important differences. So I'd like to take the next couple minutes. I know we're running a little short on time, but I'll quickly run through an example on the Yellowstone ecosystem. The Yellowstone ecosystem, interestingly, is a system that for the entire Quaternary period, approximately 12,000 years from pollen records and everything we can understand about the system, has experienced large stand replacing fires. And so this is an ecosystem that actually has evolved to cope with those fires, unlike other ecosystems. And so they have traits in their seeds to regenerate. In 1988, there was an extreme fire event. It was the 1988 wildfires. You can see the polygons of those fire in red, and the previous fires in the past 100 years in orange. And so you can see here that it covered a wide extent of the park, about 40% of the park or so. And it was quite alarming at the time because this extent of wildfire had not been seen. Yellowstone is the world's first national park, and so it was quite alarming that it might be burning up. What you can see on the left is an image of the heterogeneity of that burn, suggesting that not all areas burned in the same way. So we have areas where the needles actually burned. We have areas where the fire dropped down and just burned the undergrowth and killed the trees. And you have other areas where the trees actually survived the burn. And so as a landscape ecologist, we enter into this to ask, how does that pattern, that resetting of that pattern on the landscape by the fire, change the ecology of the ecosystem? And we try to study those patterns. And then how does the traits of those systems that have been burned govern the future regrowth of the system? And so this trait of serotiny is uneven across the park, and the areas that that tend to burn more frequently have serotinous cones that depend on fire to release their seeds, and other areas have closed cones and they sort of wait for natural regeneration processes. And so you really have a tight intermingling between the ecology of the system with those fire patterns, and that governs the post-fire regeneration. But essentially, this is an image, 2 years after a large wildfire. You can see all the trees are dead, but you're starting to see a little undergrowth come back. This is that same location approximately 10 years following the fire. It's almost unrecognizable. The trees have fallen down. You see a consistent cover. If you look closely, you can see some lodgepole pine seedlings starting to come back. And then 17 years following the fire, I just revisited this particular location a few years ago, and you can see now the trees have regrown. So fire has not killed this ecosystem, even though it was stand replacing. The trees have recovered, but that's because they have this trait of serotiny. And then by about 150 or up to 300 years, you start to get back to that recovery of an old growth state. What's interesting, by looking at the Quaternary record, we understand that is the fire cycle that has been experienced everywhere. Low elevations 150 up to high elevations 300-year fire cycle. So it seems like the system is kind of cued to recover based on that system. So our story has been like, hey, actually in some places these systems are resilient to stand replacing fire, and we have to understand that resilience and embrace it. And this is evidenced. Boring photograph that I shouldn't show you at this late at night, but basically this is the total amount of nitrogen correlated with carbon, or biomass, so you can look at it the same way. But basically by about 150 years, even though there is variability in how much was there originally, depending on serotiny and fire severity, by about 150 years, it's kind of leveled out the variation in the system. And so again, that goes back to the fact that the system has come into equilibrium with the fire cycle. But what we worry about in the future is this correlation of climate to fire. And in the 1988 fire year, there was 5% relative humidity, 40 mile per hour winds. And so there was a climate signal associated with that fire event. And if you carry that statistical relationship forward and ask how frequently are those climate events likely to occur in the future, you can project that there would be higher frequency of these large fire events in Yellowstone. And this is shown here. If you look, this is a total area burned, and in the dotted line is the 1988 burn area. This is year 2000. You can see it basically hit around here in 1988. And then this is the total GYE Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem vegetated area. And you can see by mid-century and beyond, according to those statistical relationships, we're likely to have many of those fire sizes or fires come into the future. So while it was resilient in the past to these large fires, we wonder how many times it can be hit and still be resilient. And that's really where a lot of the research is happening now. And so this is with multiple different different climate models and different time slices. Basically, the red and brown areas are areas where we're getting fire rotations of less than 30 years, and that is a significant change. We also can do some probabilistic modeling moving forward. This is, if you look up at A, I think that's the simplest one. These are the projected cumulative area burned under multiple simulations. And you can see the live above ground carbon actually being the inverse of that relationship. So as these fires become more frequent, we're going to lose biomass on the ecosystem if it doesn't have the capacity to recover. And what's concerning to us in particular, especially those of us who have said, hey, Yellowstone's actually resilient to wildfire, is that we're now seeing these reburns happening. We're seeing places that, in fact, that image that I showed you, that 17-year recovery burn just across the trail, essentially is an area where that place reburned after 17 years. So we're starting to see the realization of the predictions from the model of a fire regime that is much less like has been occurring in the last 10,000 years. And so these are sort of the moonscapes that you don't want to see in these ecosystems. And on top of that, we have other threats. We have cheatgrass even coming into some subalpine zones, of course, very prominent in sagebrush ecosystems and causing different wildfire changes in sagebrush across the West, but now are creeping into subalpine ecosystems. And so we're asking now, where on the landscape are those places that are likely to be refugia from these kinds of threats? Where should managers prioritize restoration efforts? And where are those seedlings, likely to be most resilient to some of these upcoming threats? So, okay, I talked really fast because I was running out of time, but I want to thank all my colleagues. Please follow me on Twitter and look forward to your questions.
All right. That was so amazing. Thank you both so much. I feel like I learned a lot about fire, and those are some really interesting presentations about both the historical aspects of fire and current and future. So lots of different things to think about. And we now have some time for questions. So if any of our participants, our audience members, have questions, feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section, and we will start answering those. One question that I had personally, like looking at this from a geoscience perspective, I'm wondering about like other effects that fires might have, besides direct like burning property and smoke and like ecological changes. I'm wondering if there's other significant effects on like erosion or water, like stream morphology and that type of thing that you know about?
Sure, Alan, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's there's some great research actually going on at Penn State on that. Roman DiBiase is actually looking at how fire activity influences slope processes, hill slope movement in Southern California. There's lots of evidence in the record over the past few thousand years that landslides and debris flows follow severe wildfires, particularly in the more arid parts like the Southwest and California. And I'd expect the same thing to be happening in Oregon, Washington this winter. So there's sort of terrain geomorphology is tightly linked to things that
Mhm.
do the vegetation, and fire is certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Particularly as storms become more intense too, right?
Uh-huh.
So you have really drought periods that cause the fire, and then you have storm periods directly right after that. We saw that in the California ecosystems, in fact.
That's so interesting to think about. Okay. Any questions from our audience? Oh, here we have a question. All right. So this question is from Adam. It says, it seems like we don't have a good idea about thresholds where forests or woodland ecosystems transition to scrub or grasslands. Do we risk initiating those turnovers if we start to manage the landscapes with fire now?
I could start with what we understand about the Yellowstone ecosystem, and then I'll turn it over to Alan. So what we understand about serotiny in terms of the ability of the forest to recover is that there are serotinous cones on trees by about 15 years. So remember, I was speaking to the fact that, okay, you know, if it's reburning after 15 years, is the forest going to recover? There is evidence that those serotinous cones do exist. So that's a hopeful sign that, you know, that it could withstand a threshold of that much of a tenfold shrinking of the fire regime. But the evidence isn't there yet from an observational perspective or empirical perspective to say whether that level of serotiny is actually effective at that 15-year mark, or whether, you know, you really need a 100-year-old tree to have enough cones to actually regenerate a forested ecosystem. So exactly where that threshold is between 50 and 100 years is a little unclear. And so there is concern that we are, through the mismanagement of allowing more wildfires into the ecosystem at that rate, at that tempo, that we will lose our forested systems and it will be transitioning more to a woodland type of ecosystem. Now, then there's a value judgment about this. Woodland ecosystems are valuable in their own right. Sage, you know, grassland ecosystems are valuable in their own right. You might lose some species, you might gain some species. And so at some point we have to ask how much effort and time are we going to invest in restoring ecosystems, and if they're not sustainable under this kind of climate. In terms of putting fire back in purposely into systems that required it, there is a lot of evidence there in all across the United States about how much fire is needed for given ecosystem types. So if you want to restore oak and maple ecosystems, oak and hickory ecosystems onto the landscape, you might need to put fire in every 10 to 20 years. In fact, some of our own recent modeling work by Anthony Zhao and Alan's lab as part of our project has shown that. So we are improving our ability to guide management as to what kind of fire is appropriate for that ecosystem, but it all determines on your objective, of course. That's a classic scientist speak, but you know, what do you want to achieve with that management goal? And I think what I was trying to say with the Prometheus example is, unfortunately, we have the torch in our hands and we actually do have the power to do that. We just don't have full knowledge. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Alan.
I mean, I think that covers a lot. I think also the question is tempered a little bit by sort of where you grew up, what your ecosystem you're familiar with is a lot of the forests that we walk through in the Western US today, not where Erica is, but in the drier ones, were woodlands. You know, there was sufficient fire activity to keep those forests much more open. A crown cover in a typical pine forest in Arizona or California would have only been 30% forest cover. That would have been what a forest is, and now they're 100%. So it's really hard to sort of change your perspective on that. And so much of what we had were woodlands, and the trees that grew in those woodlands could resist fire through thick bark and other life history traits. I think the risk comes in the area of when you change the nature of the fire. So you burn a forest so hot that it permits other species that are adapted to fire, have fire stimulated seeds and so forth, to gain dominance. And then if it burns again, it gets into this positive cycle like Erica inferred with cheatgrass. And so if you start to have a situation like that, it can get out of control and really maintain either a grassland or shrubland system. So it's changing the nature of the fire. I think that's pretty important. And that can happen if it gets warmer. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Adam. You want to jump on the second one there? On the state or federal policy, Erica?
Sure, I can start. I'm sure you have insights as well. One thing I'm reflecting on recently as part of our work was the role of community sort of agency and awareness of those risks and being able to manage their own neighborhoods and have control over decisions around zoning and wildfire preparedness in their own communities. And so that has been initiated nationwide across the FireWise program, where managers, where communities can propose to receive funds to initiate some preparedness measures around their homes and communities. And that has largely been effective. I will say that, in the scale of fires we're having now, sometimes that won't matter, whether you have cleared the brush around your home when you're having these massive wildfires, but they can be effective in many cases. And so providing incentives for homeowners to create those defensible spaces, as we say, around their neighborhoods is really important. Zoning for fire risk is also really important. We keep rebuilding in these same areas. We keep building one way in, one way out kind of communities, and so that's really a problem. So we have to plan with fire risk in mind, and that would be great if that were built into our structures, including insurance structures. And then finally, I'll just add, I think that in addition to that, we need to think about, we're not raking our forests of that fuel, but we are initiating in some places appropriate thinning measures. And in many cases, those can feed into other ecosystem service and livelihood sustainable development objectives. So what if we could thin around our communities and provide, thin out those ladder fuels that otherwise would create the large fires and use that for biofuel combustion and thus replace fossil fuel emissions. And those kinds of integrated solutions can solve many problems, and we just need the guidance and the incentives to do that. Alan?
No, that's fine. I think that's great. I'll take the next one. Al asks about what was the fire trigger prior to 1850, and then how were Native Americans prescribed burners, and basically you have lightning and Native Americans as being the sources of ignitions everywhere for the last 12,000 years. That's when Native Americans came to the North America over the Bering Land Bridge. So, and you can't separate them easily. But we know from ethnographic data from different locations that Native Americans burn a lot over smaller areas to manage for specific foods. But having that mosaic out there can reduce the spread of larger fires because it's broken up. And so big fire activity back in the 1800s, 1700s was driven by, these dry periods with lightning. I don't think that's changed. I don't think it's really possible to separate the contribution of Native American and sort of lightning ignitions, and I'm not sure that it's useful to do that. And so I hope that answers the question. I guess I'll take the next one from Barry on arson. A lot of fire activity currently is related to arson. And a lot of the fires that occurred in California and Oregon link back to arson, and in Australia. And so that's a different beast. That's not just sort of a random ignition. That's somebody who's trying to create trouble. And if you know what conditions create trouble, it's a real problem. So there's been a lot of that over time. It varies geographically. There's a lot more people light their woods on fire in the Southeast than do in the Northwest. And it's gonna be a role in the future for sure. And it's really problematic in some places.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it's really important form of resistance for communities against large ag or large industry. And so that's something I've experienced in Africa, a concern, even from industry, that it could only take one match and their whole industry would go down. So, you know, ensuring that those relationships are robust may be useful in the future.
We have a question about the Amazon. You want to take that, Eric, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah, I may not be up on the most recent stuff, but just to contextualize it, deforestation was on its way down in Brazil because of good policy. Excuse me, and that good policy was really initiated by global pressure on the government to halt alarming rates of deforestation of the Amazon. And then a shift in government, the Belisario government, and a shift in incentives and policy in Brazil has reinitiated this recent fire surge and the associated deforestation. Interestingly, the fires that burned this year were not some of the largest Amazon fire years, but it also wasn't a drought year. And so there is concern that if those two things did coincide, you had that sort of man-driven, policy-driven fire, and you had a drought, then we're in a bad place. So unfortunately, I don't think a lot is being done, except that there was some worldwide pressure at the time of these fires, but not really to reverse the pressures or the incentives for large-scale ag. So I think it really will require a coordinated financial and political and citizen-driven effort to promote additional livelihoods, to promote economic development within Brazil that's a little more sustainable.
Thank you both so much. That was awesome. We just went through a bunch of really good questions. Thanks also to all the audience members who have been here listening and asking questions. I think I've certainly learned a lot from this, and I hope that you have too. So it is 8:05, and I don't want to keep you all too late. So I think unless anyone has a burning last minute question,
Fun we use a lot, yeah.
make sure you speak now. Otherwise, I think we can say good night.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you all
organizing
so
it. Yeah.
much.
Thank you.